I discovered the truth from something so small it could have been missed. That day, I slipped into my husband's car and absent-mindedly opened the glove compartment. Inside was a tube of lubricant. My heart stopped. We hadn't been intimate in years, so why was it there? I didn't say a word. I quietly put it back where I found it. But in that moment, a heavy thought pressed down on my chest. Something was terribly wrong. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was wrapped in a thick kind of silence, the kind that seeps into every corner like morning fog. Silence had become our daily, uninvited guest. On the wall, the old clock ticked steadily. It was my mother's wedding gift, faithfully marking time for us for 40 years. Now, every tick felt like an accusation. Each beat cut into me, whispering that my marriage might be nothing more than a carefully crafted lie. Robert had just come home from one of his so-called work dinners. He didn't just look tired. He carried himself like a man weighed down by a secret too heavy to hold. His face bore new lines. His eyes darted away from mine. He tossed his coat onto the sofa, yanked his tie loose like it was a noose around his neck, then collapsed onto the bed, leaving it to groan under his familiar weight. No shower, no words. The room still carried his expensive cologne, but this time it was mixed with something else, sweet, unfamiliar, unmistakably feminine. It didn't belong to me. It didn't belong in this house. It clung to him like a brazen confession. Another woman had touched his life. Minutes later, Robert's snores filled the room. Once that sound used to comfort me. It meant he was home, safe, close. But now it mocked me. A lullaby for a fool who still believed in her husband. I rose quietly, moving with the practiced grace of a wife who had lived inside a marriage for 40 years. I began to tidy up. His jacket, his wallet, his phone, his old laptop. And then I saw it. His phone screen lit up. A new email. I froze. Robert never used email. He always said, "Juliet, that stuff is too complicated. I just like phone calls." So why was there an email now? My hand trembled as I picked it up. I opened it. Just one short line, enough to shatter my world. "You were amazing tonight, Dad." I went numb. It felt like someone had slapped me hard across the face. The word Dad echoed in my mind over and over, sharp and piercing. Who would write to him in such an intimate tone? Why would it sound so tender, so suggestive, with that glaring red heart? I scrolled down, desperate for more. Nothing. Just a strange address, random letters and numbers. No name, no picture, no clue. Just enough to push me over the edge. I set the phone back down, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. My whole body was ice, not from the night air, but from a fear that reached my very bones. I went on cleaning, moving like a machine. Each step, each touch felt mechanical, as if I wasn't really there, because in my head, only one question kept pounding. What was Robert hiding from me? I stood frozen in the kitchen, my hand trembling as I set the phone back down where I'd found it, but my heart was still hammering, like it wanted to claw its way out of my chest. I took a long, shaky breath, trying to steady myself. I went back to tidying up, hoping the rhythm of small chores might calm me. When I bent down to pick up the dress slacks Robert had tossed on the floor, my fingers slipped into the pockets to check them before throwing them in the laundry. That's when I felt a stiff, crisp edge of paper. I pulled it out. A receipt. I looked closer, and my stomach dropped. It was from an upscale steakhouse downtown, Chicago, dated tonight. 2 entrees, a bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon, the same red wine he'd once bought for our 10th anniversary. I bit down on my lip hard. Robert had told me he was driving out to Naperville for a business meeting. He'd even complained about the traffic and the long drive, but Chicago, he never minded going there. In fact, Chicago was where we had some of our happiest memories, and tonight he'd been there, but not with me. I read the menu line by line, 1 filet, 1 pasta, 2 different entrees, 2 different tastes. Not a solo dinner. A dry laugh escaped me, brittle and sharp. Robert hadn't taken me anywhere fancy in years. The last time was more than a decade ago when I opened my little bakery. That night had been candlelight, raised glasses of wine, pride in his eyes. Back then, I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. Now, that memory cut like glass. Everything I'd once believed in had turned into a curtain covering his lies. Looking at old family photos now felt like staring at something staged. I folded the receipt, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I took out my own phone and snapped a picture. Piece by piece, the evidence was forming a picture of betrayal I didn't want to see, but couldn't deny. I slumped into a chair, my head spinning. A soft voice inside me whispered, "Don't jump to conclusions. Maybe he was just entertaining a client. Maybe that email was a mistake. Maybe." But my reason spoke colder. No. A wife of 40 years knows her gut, and her gut never lies. I glanced toward the bedroom. Robert shifted, still snoring. His face relaxed. That false peace boiled my blood. While I sat here unraveling, he slept like nothing had happened. I rose, my hands trembling as I gathered his scattered things. Wallet, keys, then his phone screen lit up again. I glanced, but no new messages. The screen was empty. Too clean. Suspiciously clean. That blankness sent a chill down my spine. I put everything back where it belonged and sat at the kitchen table again. The yellow light from the overhead lamp made the room feel colder than ever. The wall clock ticked. Each second was a hammer striking my heart, telling me the truth couldn't stay hidden much longer. I pressed my fingers to my temples. Images of Robert flashed through my mind. The man who used to stay up late with me, who helped me when the bakery was still just a dream. The man who'd promised to walk beside me until the end. Now it all felt like a mirage. For a moment, I imagined myself standing at the edge of a cliff, the wind icy against my skin. One more step, and my entire life would plunge into the abyss. But I knew I couldn't turn back. I needed the truth, no matter how cruel it was. I pulled out my phone again and saved everything. The email screenshot, the restaurant receipt. I made a separate folder, locked it with the password. A wife can forgive many things, but once she has proof, she can't look away from the truth. I sat there with dry eyes, unable to cry. The pain had frozen into a solid block inside my chest, and I knew, from this moment on, I would no longer be the woman who just waited and hoped. I would be the woman who went looking for answers. That night, I barely slept. I lay on my back, eyes wide open in the dark, listening to Robert's steady snoring beside me. Once, that sound had been my comfort. It meant he was home, safe, close. Now it stabbed at me, sharp as needles, digging deeper into my heart with every breath he took. My mind wouldn't stop circling. The email, "You were amazing tonight, Dad." The restaurant receipt for 2. The memory of our 10th anniversary dinner. They spun together like a cruel carousel that refused to stop. By the time the first gray light of dawn slipped through the curtains, I couldn't take it anymore. I slid out of bed and padded downstairs. I made myself a cup of strong black coffee, but when I lifted it to my lips, I couldn't swallow. In the reflection of the kitchen window, I saw a woman I barely recognized. Silver hair, dark circles, a hollow face. That woman was me, Juliet. A wife who had given 40 years of her life to this family. Robert eventually came down, his hair tousled, eyes still heavy with sleep. He drank half a cup of coffee and set it down casually. "Big meeting today," he said flatly. "Might be home late." His voice was steady, his eyes detached. Lies rehearsed 1,000 times now sounded like lines in a well-worn script. I forced a smile, nodded, but inside I wanted to scream. Where? With who? Chicago again? I bit my tongue. Not yet. I wouldn't explode without proof. After he left, I scrubbed down the kitchen again, as if order in the house might calm the chaos inside me. But the more I cleaned, the more certain I became. I couldn't pretend anymore. I needed answers. I needed the truth. I thought back to a conversation years ago. Right after I opened my bakery, my friend Mrs. Miller had once said, "Juliet, if you ever doubt Robert's faithfulness, I know a private investigator. Discreet, reliable." At the time, I'd laughed it off. I thought I'd never need such a thing. But now her words returned, sharp and clear, like a lifeline. My hands trembled as I dialed her number. My voice came out hoarse. "Mrs. Miller, I need the number of that investigator you told me about. Please, I need the truth." There was silence on the other end, then a long sigh. "Juliet, what happened? Did Robert dash ? I bit my lip. Shame burned through me like fire. I couldn't bear to spill the details. "I can't explain right now, but I need help. Please." Another sigh, then she agreed. An hour later, I had a text from a man named Thomas. He suggested we meet at a small coffee shop downtown. That afternoon, I walked into the cafe. It was plain, wooden tables worn smooth with years, the rich smell of roasted beans thick in the air. I picked a corner seat, shrinking into the shadows while the room around me glowed with sunlight. Thomas arrived soon after, mid-50s, broad-shouldered, in a light blue button-down. His eyes were sharp, steady, the kind that saw more than they let on. He nodded once, polite, and sat across from me. I pulled a small USB from my purse, set it on the table. My voice shook. "This has everything I've found. Screenshots of the email, the receipt, even a photo of something I found in his car. I think my husband is cheating." Saying the words out loud cut deep. My throat closed, my chest squeezed like a vice. Thomas opened his laptop, studied the files in silence. His face revealed nothing, but a flicker in his eyes told me he'd seen enough. He jotted quick notes in a leather notebook, his handwriting precise and swift. "Mrs. Roberts," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "I understand. I'll start surveillance today. I'll keep it discreet, and I'll bring you results as soon as possible." Tears blurred my vision. I nodded, struggling to keep from breaking. "Thank you. I just need the truth. No matter how much it hurts." He placed a steady hand on the table, his eyes serious yet kind. "You'll have it. Until then, keep calm. Don't give him any reason to suspect." I nodded again, shrinking back into the old wooden chair, trying to gather the pieces of myself. When I stepped out of the cafe, the streets of Chicago bustled as usual, people rushing, laughing, living their lives. Nobody around me knew the secret pressing down on my chest, a secret about to come into the light, and I knew with absolute certainty, from this moment on, the wheel of fate had started turning, and nothing could stop it now. That evening, I stayed late at the bakery. The familiar smell of yeast and sugar still filled the air. I sorted through delivery invoices for a hotel order, trying to trap my mind inside the numbers, trying to forget the cursed email and that receipt. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Thomas. I opened it. A photo appeared on the screen. Robert, in the light blue shirt he always wore, walking into an upscale restaurant in downtown Chicago. Beside him was Allison. I zoomed in. They were holding hands. My heart hit the floor. I stared at the screen. Allison wore a tight black dress, heavy makeup, bright red lipstick, hair spilling over her shoulders. The restaurant lighting washed over their faces as they leaned toward each other. Not a father-in-law and daughter-in-law, but a couple on a date. In the frame, Robert looked at Allison with a softness I had never seen in 40 years of marriage. Not even when we were young. A second photo followed. They were seated in a secluded corner, the table decorated with candles and flowers. Allison leaned in to whisper something. Robert raised his glass to hers, his eyes crinkling with a warm, tender smile. It sliced through me like a blade. I thought of that 20-year-old girl I once was in San Diego. Long hair, bright eyes, believing our love would last a lifetime. Turns out the things I believed may never have been mine at all. I sank onto the wooden chair in the shop, hands trembling. Thomas texted again. I'll keep following. Stay calm. I didn't reply. I just saved the photos into a separate folder on my phone and copied them onto the USB I carried in my purse. Each time I pressed save, I read the restaurant name, time, and location out loud, as if hammering the truth into my skull, leaving myself no escape route. Night deepened. I kept working under the yellow glow, trays of fresh flan cooling beside me. I forced my hands to stay busy until they ached, but my heart refused to settle. Near 2 a.m., my phone buzzed again, this time a video. I slipped in my earbuds. On the screen, Allison leaned close to Robert, whispering something that made him laugh, a sound foreign to me now. She tilted her face up, eyes glittering under the light. Robert rose, then courteously opened the car door for her like a gentleman escorting his date. I hit replay, again and again. Each viewing was a fresh stab, a self-inflicted wound. I downloaded the video, copied it to the USB, wrote down notes, time, location, restaurant name. My hands moved on autopilot while a storm raged in my head. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't believe Robert and Allison, my daughter-in-law, the one I'd taught to make our families flan, the one I'd hugged like a daughter, could be together like this. But the evidence stared back at me, undeniable. I closed my eyes, drew a deep breath, then reopened the whole gallery. In one frame, Robert's hand rested on Allison's back, his fingers gentle, as if stroking something precious. In another, she tilted her head, smiling, mouth red as velvet, and he gazed at her in a way he had never looked at me, not even in our best years. The man I thought I knew down to every breath had become a stranger. I packed up, shut off the bakery lights, and carried the USB with me, like a piece of evidence from a crime scene where I was both victim and witness. Outside, the night air was cold. Wind curled around the damp sidewalks. I walked slowly, feeling each step sink into soft, dark ground. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I set down my bag, leaned against the door, and listened. From the bedroom came Robert's steady snoring, peaceful, cruel. I stood there a long time in the dark, feeling invisible in my own house. Finally, I turned on the kitchen light. I took out the USB and a notebook, began logging everything: dates, times, locations, clothes, gestures, expressions. I wrote words I never thought I'd use about my own family: hand-holding, whispering, opening car door, date, intimate, loving look. With each line I wrote, my heart seemed to shrink a little, smaller, colder, but clearer. This was the truth. The truth didn't need my belief. It stood there, naked, icy, non-negotiable. At 3:07 a.m., I closed the notebook, locked the USB away. I looked around the familiar kitchen, the dish towel hanging in its usual place, the kettle slightly off-center, the plate stacked neatly. Everything was as it had always been, except my marriage. I turned off the light. Darkness fell, but this time it didn't scare me. It felt like a curtain dropping after the first act. I knew that when it rose again, the truth would only deepen, and I would be there to record it all. I went back to the bedroom and lay down beside the man who had promised to walk with me to the end. His snoring stayed steady. My heartbeat did not. On the nightstand, it was just another night passing. But inside that small USB drive, 40 years of marriage had already taken a turn from which there was no return. The days after Thomas started sending photos and audio files, I lived in a kind of half-waking fog. By day, I still stood behind a bakery counter, scooping cream, adjusting the oven, chatting with customers in the calm, practiced tone I'd honed for years. But inside, everything had shifted. I was no longer the patient, forgiving woman I'd been. From the raw center of my pain, a different thing had grown. A cold resolve to make the truth come out by exposing their own actions. I thought long and hard about how to face them, confront them publicly with the evidence right away. That might be the safe legal choice, but it didn't feel like enough. They had betrayed me and schemed step by step to take away what I'd built, and I wanted them to confess by their own behavior. I wanted Daniel to see that it wasn't me exposing family, it would be them who laid themselves bare. That idea wasn't a flash of anger, it was careful, deliberate. I'm not impulsive, I understand consequences. Still, shame and betrayal and a hot, bitter rage turned me into a calculating woman. I decided to play a hand that would leave them nowhere to hide. I told almost no one, just a handful of friends I trusted, in the vaguest terms. And Thomas kept up the surveillance and continued to feed me evidence. I went to work preparing, always careful to keep my actions within ethical bounds. I didn't want to physically harm anyone, even the betrayers. I only wanted to force the truth into the open, to humiliate them into exposure so there could be no cover story left. First, I set a trap to get them in the same place at the same time, where neighbors and Daniel might become witnesses. My plan involved creating a disturbance, something loud and obvious that would draw attention. An alarm, smoke, unexpected noise, something that would pull people outside and prompt emergency services to check. I pictured the scene clearly. Flashing lights, sirens, neighbors peering over hedges, and then, in that spotlight, everyone would see a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law in a situation that couldn't be explained away. At the same time, I made sure whatever object I'd found in Robert's car would be rendered useless for whatever they were using it for, an act meant to symbolically take back the means by which they betrayed me. I won't and cannot describe how I did that, because I won't be a source of harmful instruction, yet the story keeps its sense of revenge, a measured countermove using their own tools against them. It felt like answering their betrayal with a mirror. I also organized the evidence. Every photo, every video clip, every audio file Thomas forwarded was copied to multiple devices, time-stamped, and cataloged with notes about date, time, and location. I printed several images and slipped them into a sealed envelope I hid in the bottom drawer of my document cabinet backup evidence in case everything suddenly exploded and public proof was needed beyond a wife's accusation. Quietly, I planted a small recording device in the bedroom, not out of malice, but to capture objectively whatever they said when they assumed no one could hear. I kept replaying the line that haunted me from one of Thomas's files. Finish the deal, get the old woman out of the house. I wanted that voice caught on tape, clear and undeniable, if it could be. Preparing felt part theater, part trial preparation. Every move was weighed. Expose them publicly, yes, but do it without physical harm, and keep within the law so I wouldn't get dragged down with them. I wanted a public reckoning, a community judgment, not a prison sentence for anyone. My revenge would be exposure, not violence. On the night before I planned to act, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, watching the street outside. The yellow street light pooled on the sidewalk. Roofs across the way looked like secrets tucked in the dark. I picked up a kitchen towel, sniffed the faint vanilla on the shelf, and realized what drove me was not endless hatred, but protection. Protecting what I had built. My reputation, the bakery, and Michael, my son. I made a simple list. Evidence I already had, evidence I still needed, potential witnesses, and the next steps if they fought back. I reminded myself that every motive had to be clean. That was why I refused to resort to violence. My chosen path was public exposure with proof in daylight before the community. That was justice in my terms. When dawn came, I felt the weight of what was to come. I slipped a USB with every file into my bag, locked the bakery early, and walked out like any other small business owner heading to work. To anyone who passed me on the street, I was still the friendly bakery owner. Inside, I was a woman who had decided to strip the lies bare, by any means necessary short of real harm, to reclaim her dignity. I remember that night like it was carved into my bones. The wind off Lake Michigan came in cold, rattling the leaves like the whispering of neighbors. But inside me, something was even colder than the air. An acute, ruthless clarity, as if every sense had been turned on full blast. That afternoon, I closed the shop earlier than usual with a perfectly ordinary excuse, an appointment that got me out of the house. On my way home, I stopped by Mrs. Walker's place, our longtime neighbor who'd always been kind enough to lend a bowl of flour or a cup of sugar when my supplies ran low. I told her I'd come for tea, and she welcomed me in without question. In my purse, I carried the little USB with every piece of proof. Photos, videos, audio files. I tucked it into the corner of her cabinet like a juror placing evidence into an exhibit. There was nothing more to collect now. What I needed was for those pieces to speak for themselves. I had planned everything carefully over several days. My aim was simple: to put them in a scene where no one could deny what they were doing, at a time when Daniel, the neighbors, and the wider community could plausibly witness it. I did not want to hurt anyone physically. I only wanted the truth exposed publicly, so there would be no room left for excuses or stolen inheritance to be explained away. At Mrs. Walker's, I sat at her kitchen table and tried to act like an old friend. She toasted me a few slices of bread, poured tea, and chatted about the weather and her grandchild starting first grade. I smiled and answered, but my mind had long since moved elsewhere. Discreetly, at Thomas's suggestion, I placed a small recording device in a corner of her house, simply to catch strange noises, since there had been odd disturbances in the neighborhood. Mrs. Walker nodded and didn't pry. She was gentle and not the sort to poke at things she didn't understand. Before I left, I made one more stop at the bakery, under the pretense of forgetting a few boxes. I went into the kitchen and rummaged as if I were in a hurry, glancing toward Robert's garage door to make sure he'd already left. Once I was certain, I did a final quiet thing. I swapped the tube I'd found in his car with something harmless and useless for their purposes. I won't describe how, that's not the point. What matters is the act itself, a small symbolic reversal, a way to blunt whatever they thought they could use to hide behind. That evening, I returned to Mrs. Walker's and sat by the window, watching my house across the street. I slipped on tiny earbuds and tuned into Thomas's live feed. He was still watching, sending photos, marking the smallest movements. Everything felt staged now, but the stage was real. Streetlights, passing cars, the pool of light from a bedroom window. Around midnight, under the dim glow of the street lamp, a taxi pulled up in front of my house. I held my breath. Allison stepped down, wearing a flimsy floral dress and dark sunglasses, and hurried inside like someone who belonged. Robert opened the door with a smile that didn't sit right on his face. And then theirs was that intimate closeness you don't expect to find inside your own home. I tuned in closer. Through the small, hidden mic, I could hear whispers and the shuffle of feet, and a laugh that sounded familiar and foreign at the same time. It felt like watching a distressing film, except this wasn't fiction. It was the life I'd built, being reshaped before me. When they went to the bedroom, the sounds tightened. Quiet giggles, then the small domestic noises two people make when they think they are private. I waited. My plan didn't need grand spectacle. It only needed an incident big enough to make neighbors come out. Smoke, a loud alarm, a commotion, something that would draw people to their windows, cause phones to be dialed, and summon emergency services. I'll not go into how the disturbance was caused. I'm telling the story, not offering instructions. But I will say that at the precise moment they felt most safe, a chain of small things I'd arranged turned the house into chaos. From my quiet seat at Mrs. Walker's window, I watched red flashes on the porch, and then neighbors spill out onto the street. I heard someone call 911. My heart pounded, not with fear so much as with the sharp, clearing sensation of justice finally making its move. Over my ear, I heard panic in the bedroom. Footsteps, a muffled cry, "We're caught!" And that panicked plea made me smile in a way I didn't expect. Not because I enjoyed anyone's pain, but because the mask had slipped. They'd placed themselves where they couldn't deny it. As sirens wailed in the distance and emergency lights bobbed at the end of the block, the long pressure that had been building in me loosened a little. A hush of exposure settled over the night, like a curtain falling after the first act. I sat very still, staring into the darkness, fully aware that once the scene ended, I would have to face whatever came next. I would accept the consequences, because I had chosen a path that was meant to restore dignity, not to destroy. That night I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. The cold, exacting calm of someone who's decided to stop being a spectator in her own life. From Mrs. Walker's kitchen window, I watched everything unfold like a tragic play. Allison stepped into my house. Robert locked the door and closed it softly behind them. They walked toward the bedroom with whispers and the light pad of footsteps on the wooden floor. The same sounds that used to be the soundtrack of my family life. In the dead of night, they thought no one was watching. They were wrong. I sat very still, breathing evenly, earbuds in so I could hear the tiniest movement in the house through the hidden mic. I heard laughter, then intimate whispers, then other sounds that I didn't want to hear but felt compelled to know. My chest tightened with every beat. I had prepared for this moment, not to hurt anyone, but to let the truth be exposed in plain sight. Then the thing that no one expected happened. A scream burst from the bedroom, sharp, panicked. "We're stuck!" Allison cried, her voice ringing with fear. I heard Robert growl, push and pull. That cry set off a chain reaction outside. Windows flung open, hallway lights flipped on, neighbors came out on porches. Within minutes, phones were ringing. Someone had dialed 911. I did not revel in their suffering. What I felt was a cold, hard sense of justice. Their false facade had been ripped away. Neighbors poured into the street, whispers and gasps rippling through the crowd. "It's them!" someone yelled. "I can't believe it," another voice said. Even as shame and grief settled in my chest, I forced myself to be calm, standing among the onlookers like a witness, not an executioner. The sound of fire engines cut through the night, wailing with a raw urgency. My heart pounded when I saw the red flashes appear down the block. Not long after, the fire crew pulled up at my front door. Then I saw Daniel, my son, leap from the vehicle with his team, the uniform dark at the collar, where sweat had already soaked through. He looked every bit the professional who runs toward danger, but there was a gravity in his face I recognized all too well. I couldn't move. Part of me wanted to rush to him and wrap my arms around him and say none of this was true. But the facts were too plain. Daniel had no warning. He and his crew forced the front door and rushed upstairs, ready for anything. I heard the thud of hammers, the faint smell of smoke, then a scream echoing back from inside the bedroom. When the bedroom door was finally breached, the sight froze me. Robert and Allison lay on the bed, their bodies stuck together. They writhed in panic and pain, their faces drained of color. The crew quickly spread blankets to cover what needed covering, while others worked gently to separate and support them. "Oh my God," people murmured, some with disgust, some with stunned pity. Daniel went in first. For a second, I saw him flinch, caught between the call of duty and his own private shock. He turned his head, forcing himself to take control and direct the scene. "Prepare to extricate!" "Keep them warm," he barked, voice steady but strained. I could hear the iron in his command, and I knew, under it, his heart was breaking. A team member reported that there was smoke, and they needed to check for hazards. The crew coordinated professionally and methodically. Down in the hallway, neighbors clustered, some shamelessly filming with their phones, the staccato clack of cameras mixing with the shouts and whispered commentary. In minutes, images of Robert and Allison, entangled and exposed, were circulating in the hands of people on the block, and in this age would be online before the night ended. I stood motionless beside Mrs. Walker while she gripped my hand hard. She whispered, "Juliet, are you okay?" I nodded, but tears leaked out anyway, despite my effort to hold them back. Shame, betrayal, grief, each wave crashed over me and left me smaller and sorer. The rescue workers stayed calm and thorough. They covered the two with blankets, kept their body temperatures stable, and called for an ambulance. An on-site paramedic checked for friction burns and abrasions and spoke to them with a mix of gentle and firm words, instructing the two on breathing and movement. Through all the clamor and the crowd's whispers, Daniel remained the commander, giving orders, directing his people with that same competent precision he'd always had. When Robert and Allison were finally carried out on stretchers and wrapped in sheets, neighbors reacted in a dozen different ways, some with pity, some with scorn, a few with grim chuckles. Daniel stood near them, face ashen. He couldn't bring himself to face his father. I felt the weight in his eyes, the kind of wound that's deeper than any physical injury. The ambulance sirens rose and then faded as they drove away, leaving behind a hush that felt heavier than the earlier noise. I watched as Mrs. Walker's video lit up someone's phone, our private catastrophe captured and instantly made public. I wanted to shout, "Stop!" But once the moment is on 100 screens, there's no pulling it back. Social media becomes a parallel courtroom. That night I came home with a jumble of emotions. A strange relief that the truth was finally visible. Humiliation that it had become public. Sorrow for my son's pain. And bone-deep exhaustion at the knowledge that nothing would be the same again. I sat in the dim kitchen light and thought about tomorrow, the day when explanations would be thin and difficult to believe. By the next morning, the chatter had already spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. News traveled faster than anything I'd ever seen. Neighbors whispering, cell phone videos passing hand to hand, phone calls coming into the bakery. When I opened the shop, Mrs. Peterson was already there, with a bag of pastries in hand, her face lined with worry but softened with support. She glanced at me, then toward the crowd still lingering at the end of the street, where, just the night before, the unforgettable scene had taken place. I didn't need anyone to tell me. Yesterday was no longer private. The image of Robert and Allison carried out on stretchers, hastily covered with a thin sheet, had become the talk of front porches, coffee shops, and grocery aisles. Some people whispered pity, others stifled laughter, and still others posted shaky videos online with captions that left no room for dignity. I felt as though I were living inside a play where the whole town had been given free tickets. Michael, my son, came into the bakery not long after, pulling his fire helmet from the truck. His uniform still carried the smell of smoke and sweat. He walked in like a man fractured down the middle. His eyes were cold, silent, but I could see the depth of pain there, heavier than anger. Standing by the counter, he spoke to the customers in a low voice. "Sorry, folks. We're still open for business today." He tried for calm, but it was clear he was retreating into a private grief no one could reach. Within hours, familiar faces began to appear. Longtime customers, a neighbor or two, the people who had stood by me since the bakery first opened. They came, bought bread, placed a hand on my shoulder. "Are you holding up?" "You're stronger than you think." Their words felt like salt rubbed into a wound, and a shield against the winter chill all at once. I smiled faintly, keeping the warm front of a shopkeeper who always welcomed people in. Inside, every phrase pierced me, but I refused to crumble. Rumors leapt to social media. Mrs. Walker retold the story, others shared clips, and within hours the scandal showed up on a local community page. People speculated, people judged, but there were also voices of kindness. One post read, "She built that bakery from nothing. Anyone who wronged her will answer for it." Reading that felt like a cool breeze against my parched heart. Officials finished their checks and announced there were no lasting medical injuries. Robert and Allison had been discharged after treatment for mild abrasions and skin burns from the tampered ointment, something neighbors whispered about endlessly. I heard their gossip in half-spoken comments and sideways glances. Some offered sympathy, some smirked with scorn. I took it all as part of the price for the truth finally being out. Daniel kept his distance most of the day. I saw him standing at the corner, watching the crowd, trying to hold himself together. When he finally stepped into the bakery, we locked eyes in silence. He didn't need to speak. He handed me a folder, photos, audio clips Thomas had secured, and 2 copies of the divorce papers I'd already prepared. He rested his hand on my shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze, his way of saying, "I'm here, even through this wreckage." But the consequences weren't limited to embarrassment. Calls came from suppliers questioning their contracts. Will the chain hold steady? Do we need to pause shipments? I answered cautiously, insisting business would continue as usual. I refused to let my private disaster derail the bakery's rhythm. Customers still came, and slowly the hum of business steadied. Some larger clients quietly backed away, but loyal ones stayed, even placing bigger orders as if to anchor me. Online, another layer unfolded. Critics accused me of staging revenge, of going too far. Their words stung. It's easy to condemn from the sidelines. But just as many voices, especially middle-aged women, sent me private notes of solidarity. They shared their own scars, telling me I was brave for standing up, for protecting my work and my dignity. Their support felt like invisible arms bracing me when the world wanted to shove me down. Michael, too, wrestled with dual burdens, the wounded son and the professional fire captain. I watched him answer calls, explain the incident to reporters in a hoarse voice, trying to balance duty with the collapse of his family life. In the evenings, he spoke less, his eyes shadowed with something I couldn't chase away. I spent those days answering phone calls, meeting lawyers, organizing the evidence again and again. My heart felt fractured, but one thing was clear. I hadn't lost everything. The bakery still stood. Michael was still with me, and a portion of the community had rallied to my side. Out of destruction, a thread of resilience had begun to weave itself. That evening, when the crowd finally dispersed, I sat alone in the bakery, looking at trays half-emptied by the day's business. The faint smell of vanilla drifted through the air, warm and familiar. I exhaled, placing my hand gently on the old clock on the wall, my mother's wedding gift. Its ticking carried on. Time wouldn't return the past, but it offered me something else. The chance to keep moving, and I knew I would use that chance to rebuild, piece by piece. The afternoon the ambulance pulled away, I stood frozen, as if trapped inside a dream. I called Daniel, even though he had already been there with his crew. I needed to see it for myself. I needed to know how this twisted play would end, and I had to be present, not only as the one who had endured it all, but also as the one who would decide what came next. At the hospital, the corridors were packed with relatives, onlookers, and too many curious faces. Some looked at me with pity, others shook their heads. Through the glass, I saw Robert and Allison lying in treatment rooms, nurses tending to their skin where the abrasions and burns showed. The staff were gentle, professional. Their job was to heal, not to judge. When the doctor came out to speak with me and Daniel, his tone was calm, almost tender. Luckily, no serious harm. They'll be fine, with ointment, rest, and a bit of monitoring. Hearing that twisted my chest. The way he said it made everything feel both grave and absurd. They had been wounded by something no one expected, and now they were being cared for. The thought brought me a mix of unease and a sharp, restless resolve. When the nurse stepped out to fetch supplies, I scanned the room. It was warm but thick with tension. Allison met my eyes. hers swimming with the cocktail of anger, shame, and pleading. Robert fumbled, searching for words he couldn't find. Beside me, Daniel stood pale, his grip tight around the folder of evidence, every inch of his stance fighting against the pain in his heart. I knew I stood at a crossroads. One path was right, the other was darker, fueled by the shame and fury of betrayal. I had told myself again and again I would not physically harm them, that justice could come through evidence, law, and community judgment. But in that raw moment, after weeks of deception and humiliation, part of me gave way. I made a choice that, later, I would recognize as merciless. I switched the ointments, not with poison, not with anything deadly, but with something that would sting, would burn, would force them to taste a fraction of the humiliation they had poured into me. I won't describe how. It is enough to say it was an act of retaliation, not instruction. It didn't take long. A shriek ripped through the room. Allison clutched her face, crying out that it burned. Robert twisted and shouted, fear and pain in his voice. Nurses rushed back in, flushing their skin, applying neutralizers, calling for doctors. In seconds, the hallway was alive with gasps, relatives pressing closer, phones raised, red lights blinking. News spread down the ward like wildfire. For one dark second, as I watched them writhe, I felt a bitter release. But almost instantly, that feeling collapsed into emptiness. Their pain didn't restore me. It didn't give back what was stolen. All it did was strip them bare. I pressed a hand to my chest, steadying a different ache, regret, small but insistent. By evening, social media had caught hold again. Videos from the hospital hall began circulating. Harsh comments poured in. Some called me a hero, praising me for a righteous revenge. Others condemned me as cruel, even demanding legal action. Reading those words, I realized something stark. The justice of the crowd is not the justice of a court, and the judgment of strangers can wound even the strongest heart. Outside the room, Daniel leaned against the wall, his head slightly bowed. He stepped forward, taking my hand in his. His voice was hoarse. "Mom, we're going to do this the right way. We have lawyers. We have evidence. You don't have to take this into your own hands anymore." I nodded, but inside me the fracture deepened. The days that followed at the hospital were chaos. Reporters called. Neighbors demanded details. Some customers stopped by the bakery. Some kept their distance. I sat across from Robert and Allison a few times. They begged. Allison sobbed apologies. Robert pleaded, stumbling over words, asking me to forgive. Daniel listened but said nothing. His eyes told me the chapter was already closed. When I returned to the bakery the next day, I found more customers than usual. Some brought words of support, others brought wary glances. The oven still hummed. The smell of butter and sugar still filled the air. Each small task, bagging bread, thanking a customer, watering the flowers out front, kept me grounded, even as the storm outside raged. But at night, alone in my bed, I lay awake. My act in that hospital had brought a form of vengeance, yes, but it left me with something heavier. The question of justice itself, and the limits of revenge. The days ahead would belong to lawyers, evidence, and the courts. Thomas's files were secure. Daniel was by my side. But deep down, I knew the legal system could only address the material fallout. The deeper wounds, the ones inside me, inside Michael, inside our fractured family, would take much longer to heal. And I, the betrayed wife, would now also have to live with the shadow of my own choices. I returned to the hospital that afternoon, the hallway still thick with whispers. The fluorescent lights cast a pale glow on tired faces and curious stares. Outside the treatment room, I paused, forcing my heartbeat to slow. I was ready. There was nothing left to hesitate over. That morning, I had called Daniel and asked him to go home and fetch the envelope I'd hidden in the bottom drawer of the cabinet. Every photo, every video, every audio file Thomas had collected, along with 2 sets of divorce papers I had prepared the night before. When Daniel arrived, his hands were trembling slightly. He didn't ask questions. He simply handed me the envelope and squeezed my shoulder. His eyes were both steely and shattered. I pushed the door open. Robert lay on his side, his skin blotched from irritation. Allison was curled beneath a blanket, her hair matted, her eyes swollen. The air smelled of antiseptic. They both turned toward me, as though awaiting a verdict they couldn't escape. I placed the folder on the rolling table beside the bed and opened it wide enough for them to see. One by one, the photos slid out. The law office gate, the 4-star hotel entrance, the balcony where his arm wrapped around her waist, the stolen kiss. The shot of them in the car with a thick folder and Allison's red pen in hand. The recording, her voice sharp and clear. "Finish the fake contract. I want the whole chain. Get the old woman out of the house." And Robert's steady, low voice. "Leave it to me. Juliet trusts me too much." I spoke slowly, my words deliberate, each one a nail sealing the coffin of a 40-year marriage. 40 years, end here. I slid the divorce papers across to Robert. "Sign them. After that, the 2 of you can do whatever you please, so long as you leave my son's life and my house." For a moment, silence swallowed the room. I heard the hum of the air conditioner, the scratch of a nurse's pen at the front desk. Beside the bed, Allison broke down, her voice ragged. "Mom, I'm sorry. I lost my mind. Please let Daniel forgive me, just this once. I'm begging you." She reached a trembling hand toward Daniel, who was standing near the door, his eyes raw and red. But he said nothing. His face hardened. Then he turned and walked straight out, leaving behind a trail of unshed tears. Robert reached out toward me, his voice shaking. "Juliet, let me explain. I never meant. I lost my way. Please, just one more chance." I stepped back half a pace, cutting him off with a voice calmer than I ever expected from myself. "Don't call me that anymore. Your chance ended the night you betrayed me." The door burst open as a nurse entered, startled by the noise. She raised her hand firmly. "Please, keep your voices down. This is a hospital." I nodded to her, then withdrew my gaze from Robert and Allison. There was nothing left to say. I closed the folder, left the divorce papers on the rolling table, and walked out. In the hallway, Daniel was leaning against the wall, his hands covering his face. I touched his arm gently. After a long pause, he lowered his hands, his eyes bloodshot. His voice broke like glass underfoot. "Mom, why Dad?" Why her? I couldn't answer. There were no words that could fit that question. I simply held my son, pulled him close the way I had when he was small, and scraped his knees in the front yard. I whispered the only truth I could offer. "I'm here." Daniel rested his head on my shoulder. A few seconds later, he drew a deep breath and straightened. His eyes were still red, but a line of determination had formed in them. "We'll do this the right way. Lawyers, the courts. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." I nodded. My heart ached, but there was relief, too. Justice would no longer be a noisy spectacle for the neighbors. It would be words on paper, signatures, courtrooms, binding consequences that couldn't be talked away. That night, I went home in silence. I placed one copy of the documents in the locked safe and the other on the shelf by the front door, a reminder, every time I passed by, that there would be no turning back. I gathered the old family photos, the birthdays and vacations where the four of us smiled wide. I didn't tear them up. I placed them in a box and closed the lid. Some things weren't worth displaying anymore. Sometimes burial is the last act of dignity. Later, I sat at the kitchen table, listening to my mother's wedding clock tick steadily on the wall. I thought of the bakery, of the employees who still depended on me, of the orders waiting for morning. I thought of Daniel, who had seen what no son should ever have to see. And I thought of myself, the woman who had spent half her life believing in a marriage, now finally closing the door on it with a pen stroke. Before going to bed, I sent Thomas a short message. "Thank you for everything. The rest is for the lawyers now." He replied quickly, "I'll be ready to testify whenever you need." After everything, the house that once overflowed with lies is now eerily quiet. No more familiar footsteps, no more sweet practice deceptions. Just me, the old walls, and the silence I had lost for so long. Each morning, I open the window to Lake Michigan, breathe in the cool air, and remind myself, today belongs to me. I brew a cup of tea, sit quietly for a few minutes, and then begin my day. I no longer wait for false explanations or carefully crafted messages. What I didn't expect was how, after the scandal, more customers began showing up. Some came to buy bread and cakes. Some just came to squeeze my hand and whisper, "You made me believe I can stand up too." A few who had never set foot in my shop came just to show support. My little bakery suddenly became a refuge for women who had walked through pain like mine. I hired a young girl to help with the work. Watching her clumsy hands reminded me of myself in those early days, full of hope, yet trembling with doubt. For the first time in years, the bakery no longer felt like a burden. It felt like joy. My son Daniel still carries a wound in his eyes that may never fully heal. He doesn't talk much, but inside that silence is a new kind of strength. Sometimes he sits in the corner of the shop, sipping coffee, just watching me work. Once he said softly, "Mom, I'm proud of you. You didn't let them take everything." The words were simple, but they soothed me more than he'll ever know. I turned away to hide my tears, knowing deep down he understood. My fight hadn't been in vain. Of course, the gossip never stopped. Some called me cruel, others accused me of planning it all. But I've learned not to care. People outside the storm always find it easy to judge. What matters is that there are still those who stand by me. Mrs. Walker drops by every week with a basket of apples or a small bouquet. Customers leave handwritten notes. "We support you." Those little gestures have been the stitches helping me close the wound. One afternoon, my lawyer called with the news. The divorce was finalized. The bakery and every asset were legally mine. I stood frozen for a moment, and then the tears came. Not tears of grief, but relief. After 40 years, I had finally laid down a burden too heavy to carry. That night I opened the wooden box of old photographs. On top was a Christmas picture, our family of 4 all smiling bright. I touched it gently and whispered, "Goodbye." Then I closed the box and tucked it deep into the cabinet. That was the last time I looked back. I began to learn how to live for myself. I joined the garden club with Mrs. Walker, planted lavender and a few tomato plants. The smell of soil and sunshine reminded me that I was still alive. On the bathroom mirror, I taped a few notes to myself. Each day is a new chance. The past does not define me. I am stronger than I think. Now, when I look in the mirror, I no longer see the betrayed wife. I see Juliet, a woman, a mother, a baker, who stood tall after the storm. If you've listened this far, maybe you've faced betrayal, loss, or the hollow ache of abandonment. I want to tell you this. You are not alone. You may lose a marriage, but you do not lose your dignity. You may lose a person, but you do not lose your ability to rebuild. I witnessed betrayal inside my own family. I endured public humiliation, but I also learned this. From ruins, you can still build a new home with courage, faith, and love for yourself. If I could do it, so can you. Thank you for staying with me through this entire story. If you see yourself in my journey, leave a comment that says, "I am strong enough to begin again." That isn't just a message to me, it's a promise to yourself. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss more true life stories. Stories that might remind you that no matter what stage of life you're in, you can always start fresh, and you can always find your own light. My name is Juliet. I survived, and now I choose to live.